All right, AP Lit students. This is the brief lecture just to get you kind of started with the first few chapters of Frankenstein. So there's a couple things I wanted to share with you, just kind of in the beginning to help you get your feet wet with this book. Um, to put this in kind of an application point of view for you, I put up a post a couple days ago about how this year's AP test was only going to cover question two, which is the prose question. Um, and to really emphasize what this means is because you're not being given a poem and asked to analyze a poem, but rather being given a piece of, let's just say, a novel or a short story, you know that what they're going to ask you to do with those 500 to 700 words before you write your response is to do a close reading. So even though it might seem, and trust me, I know this is my third year teaching this book, that this book can get slow, and the this type of a romantic gothic novel, the descriptions and the sentences can sometimes just seem to go on and on. But those are exactly the types of passages that the College Board chooses because of the fact that they're assessing your ability to closely read. So even though if you're reading for plot and you go to Spark Notes and you say, cool, this is what happens in chapter one, chapter two, chapter three, well, good for you. But that doesn't really get to why it is that we're reading this book. You'll notice if you've already looked at the chapters that the chapters are shorter, right? They're usually only, 4 or 5 pages. The entire book itself, depending on what version you have from the school, the skinny book that I handed out, the 24 chapters are only over 160 pages. So it's not a long book. And obviously, you can kind of tell by now the way that I'm um, putting this out there is we are not reading this in a hurry necessarily. The Frankenstein book will be our last book of the year. And then we'll kind of go into a little bit of boot camp, getting you ready for the AP essay test, which is, I believe for you, hopefully I'm not misspeaking, May 11th. All right, so that being said, a little bit of fun, haha, meme humor to get us started. Um, Chapter one begins the start of Victor Frankenstein telling his story. So, in terms of the frame story, the whole polar expedition with Robert Walton is now on pause in a sense because Victor, the one that they picked up off of the dog sledge that was on the ice, and he was not in good condition, he is now compelled to tell Robert Walton what happened to him, how he ended up at the North Pole, basically, almost as like a cautionary tale, and that's what we can tell so far. All right, so I'm going to reference a couple different things here. The first is just kind of some discussion notes. The second is I'll obviously try as I'm talking to go along with the book itself. And then there's a few things just from the essential background that I might reference in terms of romanticism and the link to Mary Shelley's biography, which hopefully you guys got to look at with your essential background notes. So just a couple things to frame your overall reading. These aren't things that at least now I will have you answer, but the big question here seems to be in this book, just because we can do something, does that mean that we should? It can tie back to Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. Just because you have the power to take out your crossbow and kill this bird, does that mean that you should take that innocent life? And in the essential background, we talked about some of the different scientific things, research, stem cells, these advancements in technology. Just because we have the ability to do something, does that mean that we should do it? All right. So, in other words, both the benefits and the burdens or the drawbacks of science and advancement. Other things to kind of consider, especially in these early chapters, I would think for your own kind of close reading, why do you think Mary Shelley uses a frame story? What's the function of her using this structure, not just starting out with Victor saying, all right, this is what happened to me? You might say it frames it as a caution, which we'll come into later on with more of these biblical allusions. As you read, especially the first two chapters, what was Victor's early life like? I would maybe mark down some passages. What kind of person is he? So I mentioned I wanted you guys to pay attention to characterization. Other big characters that come up during this part, Elizabeth, who is she and what's her significance to Victor? How is she characterized? I would say independently on her own, how is she characterized? What are some of the word choices now that are used to describe her? Are there certain figurative language, similes or metaphors that are attributed to Elizabeth? And how does that kind of compare to Victor? As far as character development, what do we learn about Victor as far as what his childhood was like, how he matures, the kind of person he turns into? Um, Victor's obsession. We'll point that out as we go through our first couple chapters. And then just kind of something to, again, keep in the back of your mind, because we did enter into this book with Rime of the Ancient Mariner at the forefront of our mind. But how else do you see this poem being applied in the novel? All right. So we'll come back up to those individual notes. But these are the ones I have for the first 3 chapters. So we'll kind of just jump in to the first couple of chapters together. And I want to point out some different motifs and things that I think that you should kind of pay attention to. So the speaker at the beginning of chapter 1 is Victor, and we learn some different things. He kind of chooses to go back and really say, like, I'm not just going to tell you about me, but I'm going to tell you about like my parents and how they met. So the first person that he actually begins his story with is his dad. And what he tells us is basically his father was a well-respected person. He had a briefly political career. He was involved in a lot of the affairs of his country, it says. And essentially, he didn't start a family early on. So his career was really important to him. But eventually, his father started a family. Um, we also get the idea that his dad is a very kind or generous man, because the way that he actually met Victor's mother, as he explains, is through a friend named Beaufort. Beaufort is not one that is very wealthy. And in fact, when he finally sees his friend Beaufort again, Beaufort's not doing well in terms of health. He has this beautiful daughter, and while he's staying there, Beaufort falls ill, which sickness in this book is going to be a motif. So the characters that get sick and how it affects them and when they get sick is something that I would pay attention to. So this is just kind of the first mention of sickness. So essentially, after his daughter, Caroline, stays at his bedside, he dies. And this is also where we have the introduction during this description of Beaufort's death of the motif of females. So the role of females, I want you to also pay particular attention to in this book. Now, in Mary Shelley's bio, it does mention as part of her early life that her mother was a feminist. So even back during, the 1700s, 1800s, when Mary Shelley lived, feminism, yes, was a thing, and her mother was noted for her work in the feminist cause. Now, Mary Shelley never really knew her mother, but we can't help but think maybe this knowledge of what her mother was like, because she never got along with her stepmother, was something that she kind of carried into her characters. So the way that she treats females, whether it's, oh, they're so strong and awesome, I wonder if she's trying to make a point, or it's, oh my gosh, they're so weak, maybe she's also making a point, being ironic or whatever. I just want you to pay attention to. So the first mention we get of Elizabeth is when her father is sick, she takes it upon herself to start working. She plates straw, and she finds various odd jobs in order to help support him. So we have this independent woman. However, as soon as her father died, it says that Victor's father, all right, so not the same as her father that just passed away, it says on page 17, he came in like a protecting spirit to the poor girl who committed herself to his care. So essentially, he comes in and rescues her and is going to, he takes her with him, and within 2 years they're married, even though there's this big age gap between them. So from then on, even though the first instance we get is Caroline Beaufort, this poor woman who has, tried to support her father even when he was ill, from then on, it's kind of that she is in the care of Victor's father. It says he strove to shelter her as her health had been shaken by what she had gone through, and she is pointed out to be having a weakened frame. So here, the weakness and the sickness starts to be attributed to the female roles. After their union, it talks about how Victor came to be. They had him as a son, and to give us a little bit of placement where we are, we'll go to our Frankenstein map. The first place they mention is Lucerne. Lucerne, I believe, is in Switzerland. Yeah. And so this is where Victor's father goes to meet her mother. Then they talk about Venice. So the Frankenstein family is one of considerable wealth. So after Victor is born, he is born in Italy. They travel to Venice, and it's here. Well, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. On page 18, brings me to the third motif I want you to pay attention for, which is the relationship between creators and their creations. So even though it's a weird way of thinking about this, I want you to think about the fact that with our parents are our creators and we are their creations. So one of the essential questions that I pose to you guys is, what is the ethical relationship between a creator and a creation? It's almost like asking, if you bring a child into this world, what is your responsibility to that child, right? Is it your responsibility to, clothe them, give them food, shelter them, all of those kinds of things? So just kind of keep that in mind. So anyway, when we get into the end of, or the middle of chapter 1, where they're discussing Victor coming to, being born, he says, I was their plaything and their idol, and something better, their child, the innocent and helpless creature bestowed on them by heaven. So here we could almost pick up on the fact of creations, babies, children, they're largely helpless when they enter this world, right? They're innocent, and so they rely on their parents to take care of them. So Victor's first kind of mention of his life is to say that I had these awesome parents and they did a really good job taking care of me, to raise me. On the top of page 18, this quote goes on. I was this helpless creature bestowed on them by heaven, whom to bring up good, and whose future lot it was in their hands to direct happiness or misery, according as they fulfilled their duties towards me, with this deep consciousness of what they owed towards the being which they had given life. So in other words, we could almost say that he feels his parents have a lot of responsibility to him. His entire life is going to be determined by how they nurture him early on in his childhood. Okay, so that's his initial belief and mention of creator and creation. From there, they mention being about in Italy and coming across this poor village, and his mother, Caroline, coming from a poor village herself, decides to go in and see this family. She comes into this one home in this village and sees 5 children in this, situation where there's not a lot of food and clothing. 4 of them are a very hardy stock, meaning they're hardy, they look like the peasant class, and one of them is kind of sets apart. This is Elizabeth, and the first mention of her that we get as far as her characterization is this child was very thin and fair. Her hair was the brightest living gold, and despite the poverty of her clothing, seemed to set a crown of distinction on her head. Goes on to describe her eyes as being cloudless, and it says that she seems to be of a distinct species, being heaven sent and bearing a celestial stamp in all her creatures. So she stands out from the rest of these poor people, and she's kind of almost lifted up into this otherworldly sense, right? Heaven sent and celestial being like of the stars. So kind of like too good to be true. So what happens, because the mother is very compassionate, she ends up adopting this girl who it's said is not actually of this family. She's an orphan. So now, if you're counting, the orphans we have would be Elizabeth. Caroline Beaufort herself is an orphan because her father died. So we've got 2 orphans already in the first chapter. All right, orphans, even though it's going to sound really obvious when I say this, but these are creations who no longer have their creators in their life. So just kind of to bring us back to that motif. So they adopt Elizabeth, and kind of my favorite, but not because it's really good, but just because it's a little bit like, seriously, passage at the end of chapter 1 is on page 19 when they talk about Elizabeth and how everyone loves her. When she is brought home for the first time, the last paragraph on page 19 in the skinny book, it says, his mother brought her into Victor's room and said, I have a pretty present for my Victor. Tomorrow he shall have it. And when on the morrow she presented Elizabeth to me as her promised gift, I, with childish seriousness, interpreted her words literally and looked upon Elizabeth as mine to protect, love, and cherish. And that goes on to say that she is a possession of his own. And the final sentence, and you'll notice that a lot of the chapters in this book end like this, and it's almost like makes it a little bit of a cheesy ghost story, not a ghost story, but like a scary story, is the way that they ramp up the foreshadowing in the last sentence of each chapter. So the final sentence is, She stood to be mine more than my sister, since till death she was to be mine only. So you can almost hear like the dun dun dun. Oh, we're mentioning that she belongs to you until death. So things to take away from chapter 1. Victor has a really idyllic childhood as the creation of his parents. His parents are loving. He's wealthy. He has this sister that he just, well, not really sister, but this present that is given to him that he absolutely loves. And we see that females have been given kind of the role of gifts or possessions. They're seen as very virtuous, as the compassion that Victor's mother shows in adopting Elizabeth. Also innocent and in need of care and protection. So these are some things that start to come up in this section. All right, so going back to our notes real quick here, just of things to come up in chapter 1. Let's make sure I hit them all. Yes, noting the circumstances in which sickness is established as a motif, so who it's associated with. Victor's mother is a first look at how females are portrayed in the novel. What can you make of her short appearance in the novel? So I guess kind of spoiler, what's going to happen to Caroline. Note the way that emotions are portrayed in this novel. Very intense. This is a feature of romanticism. So this is actually the other thing that I was going to touch on from the essential background. Another way that you can kind of, if you ever find yourself struggling, like, why do I even care when he's still talking about the clouds? I may, and it's not a may, I will in the future give you a short passage to read of about 500 words, and I'm going to ask you to explain how this particular passage demonstrates the characteristics of romanticism and how that affects the overall meaning of the passage as a whole. So that being said, in your notes, there is an entire section that I give you to look at where it talks about the different characteristics of romanticism. One of the characteristics is in the fact that emotions are portrayed as being very intense, because remember, romantics valued emotion over reason and intellect. So if you're feeling something, it's like, go with your gut. So even though we're going to find out that Victor is a man of science, all of these emotions that he discusses, he feels things really deeply. It's part of the human experience. All right. The motif of creator and creation. Elizabeth's addition to the family offers another view of the female role in the novel. Compare this to the mother. So that's another thing just to kind of keep in mind. The two women that we do have, Caroline and Elizabeth, how do we see their roles being developed here, and what could that possibly mean? All right, getting into chapter 2. Again, I'm going to try and keep this as brief as I can. All right, getting into chapter 2. Now we're more into the childhood of Victor. So we find a lot more out about his relationship with Elizabeth, and actually how they're different from one another. So where he is thirsty for knowledge, he likes to apply himself, and he's interested in the sciences. She's more of the poetic type. She likes to look at nature. She likes to read poetry. And just kind of daydream. And so we automatically get kind of set up, for those of you that remember the realism movement, we kind of have these two different personality types. Victor is more of a realist. He likes concerning himself with tangible physical things, things that don't involve, use of imagination. Whereas the closest person in their life at this point, Elizabeth, is kind of the opposite. We also have mentioned in chapter 2 that Victor is no longer an only child. He has a brother, excuse me. Hold on. He has a brother, 7 years younger. And it talks about the only other person he's really close to outside of his brother and Elizabeth is his friend Henry Clerval. Henry Clerval is another one who, like Elizabeth, is more of a romantic. On the bottom of page 20, he's characterized as saying he loved enterprise, hardship, and even danger for its own sake. He was deeply read in books of chivalry and romance. So not necessarily like a poet like Elizabeth, but he liked stories of, adventure and risk-taking and rescuing, damsels in distress. So not the realist like Victor was. Henry and Elizabeth both represent this kind of idea of imagination. All right, as this chapter goes on, it gets a little bit more into Victor and some of his interests. On page 21, we're given a little bit of the two sides of him. Even though he wants for nothing, he has this amazing childhood. He even says, "No human being could have passed a happier childhood than myself." He does admit, "My temper was sometimes violent, and my passions vehement, but by some law in my temperature they were turned, not towards childish pursuits, but to an eager desire to learn, and not to learn all things indiscriminately." So he is that kid that just wants to know everything, to have knowledge. We have a little bit of kind of a connection to Robert Walton here, because in the middle of the page it says, "My inquiries were directed to the metaphysical, or in the highest sense, the physical secrets of the world." So he's not only interested in knowledge for knowledge's sake, but he's interested in knowledge because he wants to know something big about the world. And we're going to find out that he has these kind of big goals for himself, these big aspirations. Um, all right, as this chapter goes on, let's see, is this the important part? No. It talks about how he starts to find some books in his father's library, which is where his interest in science comes from. And we start getting some names mentioned. On page 22, the name Cornelius Agrippa, the name Paracelsus, and Albertus Magnus. These were people who were, you could say that in their day, were considered scientists. He calls them here natural philosophers, but these were people that weren't necessarily dealing with the natural sciences, chemistry, biology. These were people that were dealing with more of occult sciences. So especially things like looking for the sorcerer's stone or the elixir of life, or studying alchemy, the process of turning ordinary metal into gold. So these kind of fantastical branches of science. And the thing that draws him to these initially is, remember, he wants to do something big. I would say the most important kind of thing to come out of this chapter is on page 23, after he's done talking about how he found an interest in science and why he's interested in science. He says, "My father was not scientific, and I was left to struggle with a child's blindness added to a student's thirst for knowledge. Under the guidance of my new preceptors, I entered the greatest diligence into the search for the philosopher's stone and the elixir of life. But the latter soon obtained my undivided attention." So the elixir of life here, this allusion, means he starts to not only be interested in science, but interested in science for the sake of finding the elixir of life. If you have the elixir of life, it means that there is not a way to die of natural causes. The only way you could die would be of a violent death. So he goes on, and this is the important quote on the top of page 23. "Wealth was an inferior object, but what glory would attend the discovery if I could banish disease from the human frame and render man invulnerable to any but a violent death." So there it is right there, his initial goal. He wants to do something great. So when we start thinking back to what does Victor see in Robert Walton and his goals and ambitions that he feels the need to tell him, well, now we see that Victor himself is also a man that has had these big ambitions, right? He wants to find the elixir of life. All right, so the rest of the chapter basically talks about how he gets really excited because he sees during a thunderstorm one day a tree gets struck, and oh my gosh, it's amazing, the power of nature. But the main point for this is that Victor starts to, as he grows, develop an infatuation or an obsession with science. The last little paragraph is again this cheesy foreshadowing. "It was a strong effort of the spirit of good, but it was ineffectual. Destiny was too potent, and her immutable laws had decreed my utter and terrible destruction." So he's telling us here that his growing interest in science is going to be the thing that eventually leads to his terrible destruction, aka why he's in the North Pole. All right, the last chapter that I asked you guys to read, or that you're going to read, is chapter 3. And before we go, let's just make sure I hit my points. Henry and Elizabeth are similar. Victor begins to allude to his sin, the thing he calls his fatal mistake. Yep. Okay, cool. So chapter 3, let's see, the last little bit we have to get to. And this isn't a good example of one of those longer chapters where you're like, oh my gosh, why am I reading this? Is this even important? Maybe a little picture on this one. Cool. All right. So chapter 3, it now gets into Victor is 17. So we had his birth, we had his childhood, and now we have, he's older. And the notable experience that happens here is our motif of sickness returns right before he is going to school in Ingolstadt, which, go back to our little Frankenstein map. Remember, he was born in Italy. They found Elizabeth in Venice. Geneva, Switzerland is where he grew up. So he's going to Ingolstadt, which is actually in Germany, and he's going there in order to study. And so we find out before he's set to leave, Elizabeth gets scarlet fever. And because the mother is, an innocent saint-like person, she risks her own health to care for Elizabeth. Elizabeth is saved, the mother sickens, and eventually she dies. So Victor's not quite orphaned yet, but he has lost a parent, one of his creators. And we see that she almost sacrificed herself in order to save Elizabeth. So the way that females, again, are characterized coming up here. On her deathbed, she actually takes Elizabeth and Victor's hands and tells them that it is her wish that they would have been married. It would make her so happy. And so now it's the father's job to kind of carry this out. So you might think like, oh, this is really nice. She was your gift and now she is going to be your wife. But I don't know how good of a marriage it would be if someone asks you to marry somebody on their deathbed. So we could look at that as also being kind of this cheesy, ominous foreshadowing. It's important to note the effect of his mother's death on Victor, because remember, the last chapter told us that one of his goals now was to find the elixir of life so that people couldn't die except by violent causes, falling off a cliff or getting stabbed or whatever. But he has a really hard time figuring out the meaning of like what it means for someone to be gone. He says, "It was so long before the mind can persuade itself that she, whom we saw every day and whose existence appeared to be part of our own, can have departed forever, that the brightness of a beloved eye can have been extinguished, and the sound of a voice so familiar and dear to the ear can be hushed, never more to be heard. These are the reflections of the first days, but when the lapse of time proves the reality of the evil, then the actual bitterness of grief commences. Yet from whom has not that rude hand rent away some dear connection?" So kind of acknowledging how terrible death is. Everyone has felt it, and it's something so hard to deal with. Eventually, again, Elizabeth, she needs to be consoled because she's a fragile female, but eventually she becomes the strong one, and she allows her presence and kind of stepping in to take care of the family in Caroline's place allows Victor to go off and study at university. So he leaves. As soon as he gets there, because he is grief-stricken, he kind of throws himself into his studies. And remember, he loves science, so that's what he would love to study. So we have the introduction of two guys in the latter part of this chapter. They're noted as M. Kremp and M. Waldman. The M just means Mr. So his two professors are these two different science guys. He lets us know that M. Kremp, who is a short, obnoxious professor, it says on his introduction, "Chance, or rather the evil influence of the angel of destruction, led me first to M. Kremp." So he's the guy that would be for all of the kind of occult sciences like the elixir of life and alchemy. He's the one to study. And so when Victor first goes to see him, which is where his interest lies with those kinds of things, these fantastical sciences, this guy just totally turns him off to it. He's gross looking. He insults Victor and says, "All those people you've been reading, like Agrippa, you've wasted your time. You'll never get any time back. This is what you need to do." So you've got this young, strong-willed guy, and the first person that he meets, who is exactly the kind of guy he wants to meet for what he wants to study, basically tells him he's dumb. So he gets a little bit discouraged, and that leads him to Mr. Waldman. Mr. Waldman is a chemistry professor. All right. And even though this is not the actual type of science that Victor's initially interested in, at the end of sitting through a lecture with Mr. Waldman, Mr. Waldman delivers this speech, and this is on the bottom of page 28 and 29. "The ancient teachers of this science promised impossibilities and performed nothing." So talking about the occult sciences. "The modern masters promise very little. They know these metals cannot be transmuted, and that the elixir of life is a chimera." Chimera is a fantasy. But these philosophers, whose hands seem only to dabble in the dirt and their eyes to pore over the microscope or crucible, have indeed performed miracles. They penetrate into the recesses of nature and shows how she works in her hiding places. They ascend into the heavens. They have discovered how the blood circulates and the nature of the air we breathe. They have acquired new and almost unlimited powers. They can command the thunders of heaven, mimic the earthquakes, and even mock the invisible world with its own shadows. So he basically, being a professor of chemistry, inspires Victor enough to where he changes his course of study. So you might think, oh, this is good. Like now it's going to put him on a more practical path. Not quite so. He's still really deeply affected by the death of his mother. And even though he decides to kind of find a mentor in Mr. Waldman studying chemistry, the last sentence in chapter 3 is, "Thus ended a memorable day to me. It decided my future destiny." And if we know his destiny is going to lead him into this terrible position in the North Pole, that's not a good thing. So, whatever happened, the amazing teacher he found in Mr. Waldman, combined with his interests, it's going to mix together to create the destruction of Victor's life. So, we kind of can find that Victor is a pretty fickle, immature guy. He believes that science is the only path to this like greatness and this knowledge. Um, so if you're not a fan yet, that's okay. He's kind of ridiculous. All right, chapter 3, just a few things to note. Sickness returns as a motif here. Note its effect on Victor. Obviously, mom's dead. Big deal. What do his educational choices reveal? Like we just said, he's very fickle. So these are the things I would kind of hone in on. Again, keep your eyes open while you're close reading for some other motifs you seem to be noticing, and always remember the F word. It's not enough that you can just identify, here's a motif, but start to think about the F word. What's the function? All right. So if you notice, wow, these sentences are really, really long in these chapters. So, right. So Mary Shelley's style could be said that she has longer syntax and descriptions. Awesome observation. What's the function? All right. Guess at it. Give me something. So hopefully you don't hate this book. If you already do, I'm really sorry because you can't really watch the Hollywood version because it starts to not follow it whatsoever. So I hope you're all staying safe and healthy, and I'll talk to you soon.